Emergency in Transit, Witnessing Migration in the Colonial Present responds to these really pervasive discourses of crisis to describe and respond to precarious migration, focusing on different kinds of testimonies. So oral, written, visual, filmic testimonies by Africans in Italy who bear witness in ways that challenge those emergency framings of migration.
I want to hear a little bit about the genesis of this book project.
This project came about through a couple of different avenues. One was that when the 2015 quote-unquote refugee crisis in Europe made global headlines, I was already working in Italy, thinking about migration there and how that was changing some of the conversations around belonging in the Italian context. And I was really interested in how migration was taking place, what was happening to people who arrived, but also how those arrivals and what happened to people after arrival, how all of that was getting mediated in different ways. And in a past life, in time that I had spent in Italy before, I had encountered the writing and art of people of African descent in Italy. And it's really their work that was carrying out the first push to restore colonial memory to Italian public conscious. So I started to ask about the relationship between this forgotten or displaced Italian history. So in very broad strokes, Italian society has yet to reckon with the violent history of Italian colonial campaigns in the Horn of Africa and in Libya. And I began to wonder what the lack of reckoning with that history would mean for the people from those places and passing through those places who are arriving in Italy today.
Do you feel like this Italian framing of migration as emergency was more broadly shared in Europe, or how did Italy inflect this issue that was particular to its like gateway status in terms of the flow of peoples?
Yeah, I think in a few ways. So what happens in Italy and the sort of the rhetorics around precarious migration are absolutely echoed throughout Europe. We also see them here in the US. So it's a kind of example or instantiation of what's happening in responses to global South to global North migration more broadly. And also what happens in Italy is contextually specific. So Italy has referred to migration by sea as a crisis or an emergency, emergenza, since at least the early 90s, when Albanians first were crossing over to, following the fall of the regime there and in the turmoil that followed, to seek safety and protection in Italy. So there's a kind of consistent, decades-long emergency that has everything to do with Italy's position as you said, a gateway for people crossing the sea to Europe, but also as a country that has, for a long time reckoned with its position as both a Southern European nation and everything that comes with that kind of southernness, but also its proximity to Africa.
One of the things that I found really interesting about your book was the power and valence you give to witnessing. So do you want to maybe give us a quick overview of the book?
A lot of my work is situated in critical refugee studies. So recognizing refugees as social and political actors and the producers and bearers of knowledge. And in the book, I bring that area into conversation with transnational Italian studies. So as I work through how this emergency apparatus plays out in the Italian context, I hold those framings in mind, and I'm interested especially in what happens immediately after people cross, and then some long-term questions about how emergency continues to shape people's lives even long after they've reached Europe. So I'm looking at Africa to Europe migration, and in terms of testimony, the book centers testimonies by Africans in Italy who are bearing witness in ways that challenge the idea that their movements or their presence constitutes a crisis.
how did you approach refugee versus migrant?
Oh, yeah, this continues to be a big debate. I, in general, use migrant as a kind of umbrella term that doesn't presume a legal status, but I also recognize that people themselves who are crossing use a whole series of terms to describe how they identify, and plenty of times they don't want to be identified solely as a refugee or solely as a migrant. In the European context, a lot of the ways that migration gets racialized and gendered have to do with how these labels get applied, and there's a larger criminalizing discourse. So there's rhetoric that pins migrants as threatening criminals because it would say they are not real refugees, but economic migrants. And so they're crossing the sea only to game the system and take advantage of European welfare systems. So that the term economic migrant is very loaded. And when I use migrant, I always try and qualify it by saying, I just mean, someone who has crossed a border. Yeah. But there are a lot of other ways that you could, so sometimes I will say just like people on the move, or if I'm talking about an oral history that I did, maybe I'll just say the narrator, that kind of thing, to try and avoid describing all of these dynamics in terms that get politicized in discourse or terms that are just kind of default terms people use from the state. So I think challenging some of that means we have to think outside those terms.
You talked a little bit earlier about the racialized and gendered aspects of this playing out. I wonder if you will speak a bit more to that.
Yeah, I think when you say migration in Italy and maybe in Europe more broadly, the image that comes to people's minds is of a young Black man. That's in part because it is the majority of people crossing the sea, and I'm talking here specifically about the central Mediterranean. Most people crossing are young Black African men. It fluctuates. Sometimes there are more North Africans, but women consistently comprise at least 10% of people crossing. And of course, all of these numbers I think we should question because they're approximations and plenty of people don't get represented in those numbers. So because of who's crossing, representations of migration often center that young male figure, young male Black figure, and that gets tacked onto the discourses I was talking about a minute ago in terms of, this idea that these aren't deserving refugees, they are threatening, potentially criminal people who are trying to game the system, and that gets projected onto the figure of the young Black man. That's associated with longer ideas of race in Italy, certainly, and in other European countries where Blackness is not considered to be part of the national body. So it's another way in which, in the Italian context, for example, whiteness gets reified and associated with Italianness. In terms of women crossing, and I'm talking in binaries because of the ways that these are represented, but in terms of women crossing, when they are represented, which is less often, they're often represented either as helpless victims, so only in terms of vulnerability and a kind of faceless vulnerability, or as sexually deviant. So there's a lot, and this is also a longer history related to colonial ideas of race and gender and femininity that posit Black African women in particular as prostitutes. And it's also true that there is sex trafficking does happen, but I'm talking about the stereotypes that get projected onto women who are crossing no matter what the circumstances. So I've done some other work in longer interviews with women, for example, who I'm thinking about interviews with a couple of Nigerian women who, when they're living in these reception centers, so they're living, in rooms with other women, but they're housed with other asylum seekers, also men. They are very aware of those stereotypes getting projected onto them, both by Italian staff, Italian locals when they leave the center, but also, other asylum seekers living in proximity. And that really, and it really affects how they, whether they leave their rooms, whether they feel comfortable going into the city center, because they don't want to get they don't want to be treated as suspicious in that way.
What were some of the things that you feel like you couldn't get to that you would have liked to get to, or?
I mean, I guess mostly I'm thinking right now about how the book kind of covers 10 years, a 10-year period, more or less. But a lot of what I cover there has continued, and policies have gotten even more restrictive. So I don't know in terms of things that I wish I had done, but right now I'm really interested in the idea of protection more broadly, and thinking about different kinds of sort of documentary practice, forms of documentation that are connected to the ideas we have of protection, whether it's international protection, so a legal status, or the idea of national security, these things that are often in tension.
What are you looking forward to doing next? What are you working on now?
So I'm thinking about this protection idea, and I'm continuing to work on a few different areas, and one of them is rescue. So over the summer I spent some time with crews. So these are NGO-funded crews who carry out rescue at sea, thinking about how they are both doing the work of rescue, but also documenting that work for different audiences. So that's one area. I'm doing some legal observations at a legal clinic, but I'm also very interested in how some of what I'm seeing in the Mediterranean context, so Italy, Malta, Greece, in terms of these sort of tensions around ideas of protection, how those also translate or don't into a US context. So what does protection have to do with ideas of sanctuary or abolition, and how can these different contexts maybe inform each other?